Good afternoon. This is Daniel here with Cop Watch TV, and I am the host of the live show. And what we're going to do today is we're going to go over and break down some of the most interesting and important cases that happened in policing over the last couple weeks. So, just a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going today. The first couple cases that we're going to cover involve chief of police. So typically when we talk about, controversial officer involved shooting or, something interesting that happens in the world of policing, usually it doesn't include a chief of police because typically a chief of police isn't going to be out there on the street taking calls for service. But there's been a couple different incidents around the country that involve a chief of police that we're going to talk about first. And, also we're going to talk about this. We're also going to see, what kind of a role does the chief of police play? Incidents like this, do they hurt morale in a department? Or even more importantly to ask, is there something good that can come out of this? Again, if you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel over here at Cop Watch TV, and make sure you go ahead and share it with friends and family, just so we can get as many people as possible into these live shows. So we typically do this on Friday around lunchtime, usually just after noon Mountain Time. Really curious to see where everybody is watching from today. We got Gary from Indiana. How's it going? Autistic Shill. Hey, how's it going? We have Jason from Georgia. And we have Vicky from Massachusetts. Mr. Schill is from Winnipeg. And let's see, Bears and Cigars. Looks like Bears and Cigars has an emblem of the Chicago Bears. So, I'm gonna be real honest. I'm pretty biased towards that because I'm from the south side of Chicago. I'm a huge Bear fan. My dad had season tickets to the Bears my entire time growing up. So pretty excited about that. Bears and Cigars. I got Based from Oregon, Sheepdog from Pennsylvania. It's good to see everybody. And we got James is from San Jose, California. It's good to see everybody in, just like we do every week. While I'm going through some of these cases, if you have any interesting comments or context, or even if you disagree with me on some of these cases, go ahead and put it in the chat. One of my favorite things to do while I'm doing this show is to kind of go back and forth and answer questions, or maybe your opinion is more educated than mine on something. So I definitely like to hear it. Besides talking about the two cases that involve police chiefs, we're going to talk about two controversial officer involved shootings. One of them is a little funny, and I because no one was injured, I want to say that it's funny. And the last one is going to be a controversial officer involved shooting where the police officers might get charged. It's that kind of a case. Ben Crump is involved, so we'll be interested to kind of see what happens in that case. And also, again, like, my name is Daniel. You can go ahead and follow me everywhere over at Police Law News, over on Twitter or X, Instagram, everywhere. I do content pretty much throughout the day on those other channels. All right, so the first case that we're going to talk about today, this happened in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And, like I've said before, I recently retired from the Albuquerque Police Department. So, I do want to let you know that I know just about everybody involved in this case, even though there's only one person who was involved in this case. So let me go ahead and explain what happened. So the chief of police in Albuquerque, New Mexico, his name is Harold Medina. He's been our chief in Albuquerque for probably about 4 or 5 years or so. And he was going to a press conference last Saturday in an area of the city. Now, I want to say that this area of the city, it's not a good area of the city. It's a pretty high crime area of the city. When I started, it was called the War Zone. Now, that wasn't the official title of it, but a few years ago, well, maybe about a decade ago or so, the politicians who run the city said, we're no longer going to call this place the War Zone. We're going to call it the International District. So, that makes it seem nicer, but here's the problem. So you don't do anything to really, stop the crime or to stop the crime in the area. So it's no longer called the War Zone. It's called the International District. Again, changing the name really doesn't change exactly what happened, what happened there. But it does seem like, some scenes that we've seen recently from Palestine and Syria and Iraq, because this is one of the highest crime places in the city. So the chief of police on a Saturday, he was actually heading up there to do a press conference with the mayor. And what I can say on behalf of the chief is, this is a Saturday morning, and here he is spending his time doing a press conference to talk about crime in a high crime area. This is absolutely the kind of thing that we want to see a chief of police do, and that's what Chief Medina did. While he was on his way up there, he was headed to the press conference, and he was with his wife was in the car, and I'll get to that in a second. That we do have a policy that, police officers can take spouses, wives, children, in their police car. They can go ahead and take them with them, in the car, if it's for a legitimate reason, picking up to and from. There really isn't any policy against that. One of the reasons why the Albuquerque Police Department did that is essentially, the best way I can describe it is to kind of give it a perk. It's one of the things that Chief Medina has been in favor of, which I think is a good thing. So as the chief was headed up there with his wife in the car, they came upon on Central Avenue. Which is a big street in Albuquerque. They came upon basically a homeless camp kind of on the side of the road. The chief stopped to kind of see what was going on with this homeless camp that was essentially kind of spilling out over and into the sidewalk where there are businesses there. And what the chief said he was going to do is he was going to go ahead and give a call to the area commander, give them a call, and basically have some officers come out there and talk to the individual, see if they needed any help or if they were committing any crimes. However, while the chief was doing that, kind of stopped there on scene, two of the bums got into a bum fight, like right there. The chief's wife said, "Hey, look, these two guys are in." I call it a bum fight. I'm guessing that the chief's wife didn't call it a bum fight, but she let the chief know, hey, there's two individuals who are fighting right there. It was at that point that one of the individuals pulled out a gun, and the way that this was structured is that essentially the gun was pointed in the direction of the vehicle that the chief and his wife were in. It was at that point that a shot was fired. As soon as that happened, the chief basically, the best way that I can describe it and what I see on the video evidence, he basically hit the gas. He hit the gas, he got out of there, he ran a red light, and as he ran a red light, there was a classic Mustang vehicle. Full send it, right? There was a classic Mustang vehicle that was essentially going the other way on the street with a green light. The chief ended up smashing into that car, totaled the classic Mustang. The driver of that car, he did sustain some pretty serious injuries. So that's what happened in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was the individual was it was a critical transport to the hospital. My understanding is the individual will survive, but he does have some pretty serious injuries. Now, as you can imagine, when this happened he's going to have 10 plus surgeries to the victim of this. You can imagine that when this happens in a city like Albuquerque that has 600,000 people, 1,000-person police department, when the chief of police is involved in a crash like this, there's going to be a lot of questions that are asked. One of them is, because Albuquerque police officers have body cameras. The police department was one of the very first large police departments. This police department was one of the very first large police departments in order to have body cameras that basically all officers have to wear. There's a body camera policy that basically says that, anytime you get out of your car for a law enforcement contact, that you have to turn on your body camera. So one of the first questions is, hey, do we have any body camera footage of this? And the answer is no. The chief did not have his body camera rolling. Again, not in defense of the chief, but just to say, if the chief did something right, here's what he did right. He basically said that admitted in public, he admitted in public that he did not have his body camera running, and he essentially referred himself to internal affairs. He turned on the body camera footage about 4 minutes later after the crash happened. So he did refer himself to internal affairs. Because his wife was in the car, now there's been all kinds of different articles in the paper about, hey, let's look at this policy about allowing family members to ride in cars. Well, again, it's just because the chief of police was involved in an incident doesn't mean that it should be taken. So I'm really curious about people who are police officers or retired police officers or former officers on here. What kind of a policy do you have? Do you allow family members to ride with you in the car if you're going to and from someplace? I'm really curious about that to see what other people have to say. I think it's a good policy because you can use the take-home car to pick up kids to and from school. You can drop your wife off somewhere if you're on your way to work. I think it's a good policy. So that's one of the things that I want to talk about with this. I guess my main takeaway from this case, because a lot of times we talk about these cases, but there are some pretty important takeaways from a lot of these cases, and please put in the chat if you disagree or if you have something else. My biggest takeaway on this case is basically a lot of times police officers, I know that when I was in the field working, when I would be frustrated, I would go to internal affairs, or I would have something happen where a supervisor didn't like what I did, or I did something and then 4 months later some supervisor 4 or 5 levels up would discipline an officer for that. Not even me, it was an officer that I was working with. I would be frustrated, and I would say something to the effect of they should be the brass, the people who run the police department. I'd like to see them take a call for service. I would like to see them. How would they haven't been in the field for so long. I'd be real interested to see how do they handle it in a dynamic situation that's dangerous. How would they act in a situation like this? It's real easy to sit back here, not just on the show or me now because I'm retired, me at my house watching body camera footage. There's a luxury, there's a privilege to being able to sit back and just watch what other people do. But when you're in the moment and it's stressful, how do you act? And that's something that a lot of police officers around the country want for their supervisors. Well, now we know. Now we see. This is what happened when the chief of police was put in again, a situation that he didn't cause. He didn't cause the fight. He didn't cause the gun. But it's a situation that he didn't cause that really, through no fault of his own, was an immediate dangerous situation. And he was just thrown into it. And I think we have to acknowledge, and the good, here's the good. The good that I hope comes out of this is that not just the chief of police in Albuquerque, but essentially the people who run this police department and hopefully other police leaders around the country just have some acknowledgement. Just kind of remember, hey, this is what it's actually like when you're in the field when something happens. Again, to the chief's credit on this one, he did say in the media, he said something to the effect of that I thought was good. He basically said something to the effect of, now it's been a while since I've been on patrol. Now I can remember what it's like to be that first line officer, to be right there when something happens. So that's the good that I hope comes out of this, is that, a lot of times humans, no matter what your training is, no matter what your experience is, when you have a natural human response, when you are put in a stressful situation that is dynamic and you didn't expect to happen, this is how the chief of police, he has over 30 years of experience, this is how he acted. This is how he responded. And that humans, no matter if you're the chief of police or you're 1 month out of the police academy, you may not react perfect. And when we discipline officers or we fire officers, we should do it all within that context. That, sometimes humans make mistakes. It doesn't mean that they're a bad person. It doesn't mean that they were trying to harm anyone. Obviously, the chief of police, his intention, I always talk about intention on the show, and when I write articles on my Substack, I always talk about how important that, I admittedly use someone's intent. I maybe put too much weight on that. What someone was trying to do, I almost put too much emphasis on intent. D. Porter just gave us a super chat. Hey there, love your channel. It's the first video I watched of yours was the one of the New Mexico cop driving drunk and killed 2 people. Very sad. D. Porter, that was a sad case. We do try to cover cases like that all over, not just in New Mexico, but also all across the country. D. Porter, really appreciate the support. Thank you so much for that super chat. Really, really appreciate it. Steve Ladner says, where was the good officer that we always hear about? Well, Steve, you don't really hear about it because it happens so much. But one thing, D. Porter, so the individual in the case that we're talking about, just to give you an update, that officer on that case, he was actually sentenced to 20 years in prison for what he did on that particular crash. I should just say that law enforcement was taken and removed from the Okay, so not everyone is going to act perfect in a situation that is a dynamic and stressful situation. So if anything comes out of this, like I said, I hope that the individual I'm talking about intent. Let me finish that up real quick. So it's like I always look at intent. So what was the intent of the chief? The intent of the chief was to attend a press conference at 10 o'clock in the morning in order to highlight a dangerous area of the city. That's a good thing. And then on his way there, he wasn't just a lazy chief, right? He on his way there, he saw a problem that he was going to try to address. There's no ill intent there. If anything, that goes in the category, that goes into the bucket of, hey, he's actually trying to do something to make the city a little bit better. He saw a problem and he was going to contact someone to do it. Now, yes, of course, driving away kind of in a reckless manner, injuring someone, that's not good. But again, the chief in this situation didn't have bad intent, and all that we can hope for is that, if he does go through the internal affairs process, that essentially he will get any discipline that any other officer would. And then to kind of keep in mind that, officers aren't perfect, and as long as they have good intent and there's some kind of mistake that happens in the moment, just to keep that in mind when it comes to not just watching body camera videos, but for people who are actually leading police departments, to kind of keep that in mind that, this job isn't as easy as it might seem watching body camera video from the safety of your own house. Okay, so that was the first case involving a chief of police I want to talk about. And there was another one. It's actually body camera footage that I found. I actually saw the footage yesterday. I put up a little video of it on my Instagram. Before I got here today, it was at about 200,000 views. So it is something that, so people do think that this case is pretty interesting, and I'm not the only one who's getting a whole bunch of views on this particular case. But essentially, this happened in Bradley Beach, New Jersey. Now, I've never been to New Jersey. In doing some research, it sounds like this is kind of the area of like the Jersey Shore. So, basically, there was a sergeant. His name is Sergeant William Major, and he was on a call for service. It was essentially a crash. It was a multi-vehicle crash that involved injuries, and there was also one of the individuals was possibly a drunk driver. So he was the sergeant on scene, basically trying to manage a multi-vehicle crash and also a drunk driver. So, he had officers doing those things, but as the supervisor on scene, you want to make sure that those things are being done. So again, yes, and his car was actually helping to block one of the officers who was doing a DWI investigation, basically so all that stuff could be done safely. So while this was happening, an individual walks up to him, and at first, unless you were local there, you really wouldn't know who this individual was. He was, a 50-something-year-old white guy who was not dressed in any kind of a uniform. He was in street clothes, essentially. And from the first word out of his mouth, you could tell that he was drunk. Me watching the body camera video, it's very obvious that this person is intoxicated. And, pretty quickly into the body camera footage, Sergeant Major refers to this guy as chief. And this ends up being the chief of police. So, again, now I think police chiefs have it in their contract that essentially they work 24/7, meaning like if something happens at 2 o'clock in the morning, they may have to go out. So I'm going to use the words off the clock, not because, and I get the argument on the other side can be, well, a chief is never off the clock. They're compensated usually pretty well, but again, they may have to respond all the time. But since this guy was, it appears to be intoxicated, I'm going to say that he was off the clock. He wasn't doing a police-related activity before this, right? So he basically walks up to the sergeant, drunk out of his mind, and he starts giving the sergeant shit about what kind of a jacket he's wearing. So the sergeant is wearing some kind of a jacket, and because this is body camera footage from the sergeant, you really can't tell exactly like what's on the back of the jacket. But the chief basically says that it says police or something on the back of his jacket, and it's faded. So the chief is giving him shit about wearing that jacket, and the sergeant goes, "Hey, chief, we can go ahead and talk about this later. Like I'm trying to work here," and the chief just won't let it go. He keeps bugging him. He walks up to him multiple times, and finally the sergeant just says, "Chief, I don't have time to talk about the jacket. I'm dealing with a crash with injuries and a drunk driving investigation. We can talk about this later," which, is a pretty reasonable thing. Even though there's a chain of command and the chief is in charge, it's a pretty reasonable thing for the sergeant to say. And the sergeant, he's actually at the beginning of the video, it seems like he's trying to cover for the chief because the chief is saying things obviously drunk that are obviously idiotic. And the sergeant kind of lowers his voice. He's kind of like, "Yeah, okay, chief. Okay, chief. We can go ahead and talk about this later." So it seemed like he was trying to de-escalate the situation and work pretty much at the same time. And what happened is that at some point the chief wouldn't let it go. So not only was he kind of yelling at the sergeant from the sidewalk, he walks up to the sergeant and he grabbed him. But he grabbed him by the arm. And as soon as he did that, the sergeant responded pretty much immediately. He pushed the chief back. He said, "Don't touch me." And he pushed him onto the hood of the car. The chief starts yelling. So the sergeant and the chief stands up and the sergeant kind of pushes him. And anyone who's watched this video, to me, there is no question that the sergeant was in the right on this, because right after that, the chief tells the other officers on scene, he points to the sergeant, he goes, in his drunk voice, he goes, "Take him in, take him in." Basically trying to get the officers to arrest the sergeant for what just happened. Obviously the officers didn't try to arrest the sergeant, but it's pretty interesting. It goes on for a while, and then after that the chief keeps saying, the chief keeps saying things like, I love you, and all that kind of stuff. Like, "I love you, you're a sergeant here." You could tell that their relationship, that maybe there's something there, but it's weird for the chief to act like this, but then drunkenly say that he loves the guy. And he keeps trying to pull the sergeant off the scene. He's like, "You have to meet me back at my office. You are suspended right now. You have to meet me back at the office." And the sergeant is like, "Well, if you want me, if I'm suspended, I'm going to go home. I'm not going back to the office right now." So I don't don't think the sergeant did anything wrong. I mean, in fact, I think the sergeant acted, pretty good here. Reference the situation that was dealing with it. I should say that the sergeant was also a canine sergeant, so it's reasonable to ask, does the canine get suspended too? But what ended up happening, so here's was basically the fallout from that. So both individuals were put on leave while there was some kind of investigation. The sergeant actually went back to work pretty quickly, which is a good thing. And sergeant went back to work. The chief, who makes I think $175,000 a year, he was put on administrative leave. As far as I know, he's still on administrative leave. They have an acting chief in there. So it looks like when this actually got to investigators or people to actually look at this, it's pretty interesting to see that I think this went the right way, that the chief was clearly in the wrong. The sergeant's back at work, and it looks like the chief is going to lose his job, or he should lose his job, because this isn't the kind of thing that a chief of police should be doing. One, he's intoxicated. He shouldn't be doing anything law enforcement related. But even if he was sober, can you imagine working for a chief? Here you are on a crash, trying to manage a crash, make sure everybody's safe, and make sure officers do a drive while intoxicated investigation, to do all that, and you have a chief of police yelling at you about the wrong jacket. Obviously, if you're wearing the wrong jacket, you could have a wardrobe conversation later. This isn't the time or place. No reasonable supervisor or chief of police would have a conversation about that right then. Cajun Randy says once he was told he was suspended, he should have went immediately home. I agree, Cajun Randy. He should have said. It seemed like the sergeant was like, well, I still want to at least finish up this call, because like my car is literally blocking where where there's a crashed car, so I'm kind of helping. So it seemed like he kind of wanted to at least finish that call and do the right thing. But Cajun Randy, I agree. And again, it's like also the chief is drunk. So what happens then? And because the chief put his hands on him, is there going to be some kind of a criminal investigation? So again, the idea that the sergeant is going to stay on scene, like, I get it, but it's an interesting conversation. Steve Ladner says the chief will be rewarded with retirement. Anyone else would be fired and in jail. Yeah, Steve, so it looks like he's not going to be the chief anymore, so he's lost his job. But Steve, most of the time when you reach the level of chief of police, you're already eligible to retire. The 20 years I was with, hey Ethan, how's it going? The 20 years I was with the police department, I think I had like 4 or 5 different chiefs of police. They were all retired, they all had retired and had come back to work. So again, say Steve Ladner, say he's rewarded with retirement. Well, again, it's likely this chief was already, eligible to retire. So yes, he gets to retire. That's what happens. Anyone else would be fired and in jail. I don't know about that, Steve. I mean, if you work for Walmart and if you put your hand on a police officer, is Walmart going to fire you? I'm going to say probably not. And I'm not trying to defend this chief, Steve, because I think the chief was in the wrong. But again, the chief lost his job over this when, in almost any other industry, if you acted like this, you wouldn't lose your job. I do think the chief should lose his job, because I think that police officers, especially a chief of police, should be held to a higher standard. But again, in most injuries, if you worked in the tech sector and this happened, you couldn't do that. Steve Ladner, can you draw a full retirement if you get fired? Oh, Steve, that's such a good question. So it's gonna vary state by state, but Steve, in general, yes, you can. Typically you can. So the way that retirement works, again, in most places, someone correct me if I'm wrong, is that the way that you get to retirement is you have to work so many years. So you have to work so many years. In some places, like the place that I worked, I had to work 20 years. If you work 20 years, then you get a pension, right? So let's say an officer in other places like Indiana, it's this weird math problem. Cops are terrible at math, so this makes no sense. In some places like Indiana, it's some kind of a math problem. It's like you have to work this many years and you have to be this old, this many years old, and it has to equal 75. And it's like it's a math problem to determine when you can retire. So Steve, I guess where I'm going with this, let's say it's a 20-year retirement. Let's say you're the chief of police and you've worked 22 years, and you mess up like this chief did. You've already met what's required to retire. So just because you get fired or you resign under bad circumstances, you typically don't lose your pension. The way that you would lose a pension, Steve, and again, I'm going to say typically in most states, is if you do something criminal on duty. Do you guys remember the case? I'm not going to remember his name off the top of my head, but the police sergeant in Bolingbrook, Illinois, Drew... can you guys help me out? Drew, I can't remember, Sergeant Bolingbrook, Illinois. He was convicted of killing his ex-wife. And then Drew Peterson in Illinois, retired police sergeant from retired police sergeant from Bolingbrook, Illinois. He was convicted of killing his second wife, and then his third wife actually went missing, and then they never found her. He's in prison for that. So while Drew Peterson was in prison, they actually, because he had earned his time to retire, they actually went back and they were able to through the state of Illinois, they were able to basically pull his pension or get his pension taken away because he committed, crimes on duty. So that's typically the way it goes. Otherwise, as long as you meet whatever time there to get a pension, you typically get a pension. Hope I answered your question, Steve. All right, let's see if we have any other questions. Let's see. James Echo, won't be the first time a chief got into it with one of his officers. I agree, James. It's not. We've showed other videos like this before, but this was interesting mostly because of the intoxication level of the sergeant. And but we have played videos like this before. JS says the higher they go up, the more shit they cover up. Does this include stitching people up? So I mean, this is just one of those things. With body cameras, any of the corruption stuff like that. Hopefully, the more we have body cameras, hopefully the less of that kind of stuff we have and not being able to cover things up. So now I'm going to talk about a couple officer-involved shootings. They're both. I guess I would say I always use the word controversial, but the first one really isn't controversial. It's kind of funny. The second one is controversial, and I know we're going to have a difference of opinion about whether or not the police officers should be charged with crimes. But this one I'm going to talk about, it's basically the Acorn case. If you haven't seen the memes on the Acorn case, I'm kind of glad this happened just for the fucking memes. This thing is absolutely ridiculous. There's a couple people that I really like. I follow them both. Drew Breezy, he's over at What Say Drew over on Instagram. He's a retired lieutenant from Florida, and he runs the Com Center podcast. Another individual I follow, he's from Columbus, Ohio. Thoughts of a Police Officer with Officer Ben. And they've gotten to a pretty heated spat over this case the last couple days, and I like them both, so I'd like to see them reconcile. So I can see even people who are pro-police in the police world kind of have some disagreement over this, or at least how this should be covered. I'm basically taking it that sometimes funny things happen in policing, even if it's over a shooting. As long as no one gets injured, it's okay to laugh about it. It just is. A lot of this job and being a police officer is having a dark sense of humor. And when someone does something stupid, you should be able to say it. This guy did something stupid. This happened in Oskaloosa County, Florida. And essentially, basically what happened is the officer mistook, and I'll get into the details here in a second, but the officer mistook, oh, hey, Brittany, how's it going? The officer mistook an acorn falling on him for gunshots, and he ended up firing an entire magazine into his own patrol car. I know that sounds crazy. I'm going to explain what happened, because if you just hear it there, it sounds crazy. Now, I'm going to try to explain it. It's still going to sound crazy, but maybe it'll make a little bit more sense. And again, the memes on this are keeping this thing alive, which it absolutely should, because this is absolutely hilarious. So basically what happened is so this officer, I think he had 13 months on. So basically, you usually do a year. He basically you do a year of probation, and then you're basically off probation. So this guy had 13 months on. His history is that he went to West Point, so he was in the military. I think he was deployed to Afghanistan twice, but he wasn't in the combat zone. So he wasn't in any kind of a combat zone, but he was deployed twice. So he does have at least some military training and military experience. He had 13 months on the police department, and he I'm being told that he's what a military guys call a fobbit. I don't know what that is, but I'm not a military guy, but that's what I am being told. I'm being told. And James S. says, yeah, apparently he got a squirrel. He did. Forward operating base person who doesn't go into combat. Okay. So basically what happened was they arrested an individual for stealing a car. So they have this guy in custody for stealing a car. He's in handcuffs. He's in the backseat of the police vehicle. And while they're doing the investigation, somehow they get some information. Either it's someone on scene or it's an investigator. Somehow they find that, basically right before they arrested this guy, that he had posted a picture or shared a picture of him in the car holding a gun, basically pointing a gun in the car. So now police officers are thinking, okay, so we have this guy who's under arrest for stealing a car, and here's a picture of him literally just a few minutes before holding a gun in that car. And when they searched him, they couldn't find a gun. So now police officers are thinking, okay, so there's probably a gun somewhere, and they search the car, the gun's not in the car. So now the officers are kind of thinking, okay, did he conceal the gun on him? Now I know this sounds silly, I get it, but it actually has happened before. It absolutely has happened before, where someone was able to hide a gun, conceal a gun. A police officer just didn't do a good enough job searching the individual, and that the individual is actually able to shoot the police officer. So again, it doesn't happen very often, thankfully, but it's not impossible. It actually does happen. Before I retired from the Albuquerque Police Department, I was teaching a class called ABLE, Active Bystandership in Law Enforcement. In that class, we actually cover one of those cases that actually happened this way, that an officer didn't do a search as good as they should. The guy went into another person's car. That officer didn't do a search even though they were supposed to. And as the officer, who was a father of 3 kids, as he was driving, he didn't have anything to do with this guy's arrest. He was just a transport officer. As he was transporting transporting the guy to jail, the guy was able to take out a concealed gun that he had, even though he was in handcuffs, and he actually shot the officer and killed him. Very sad. So again, doesn't happen often, very rare, but still possible. So let's go with this. So in a situation like this, is it reasonable that you would search this guy a second time just to make sure, knowing that there's some evidence that he had a gun? Yes, that's not unreasonable. And yes, of course, I'm going to say, just like everybody is probably shouting at their screen right now, well, it's their responsibility to search him really good before you put him inside the car. I agree with you 100%. So that's kind of the mindset of the police officer, is basically he's walking back to his car thinking this guy may have a concealed gun on him. That's what he's thinking. As he's walking back to the car, you spelled karma wrong there, right? It's camera action. As he's walking back to the car, he basically, acorns from a tree above, acorns start coming down from the tree above. One of the acorns hits the car, one of the acorns hits the officer's leg, and for whatever reason, he doesn't say, hey, there's acorns falling on me, that's kind of funny. For whatever reason, he starts to think that the person in the backseat of the car is shooting at him, and he acts in pretty much the most ridiculous way possible. He hits the ground, he starts rolling around, he says, shots fired, and then he starts yelling, I've been hit, and he basically creates distance as he's doing these crazy barrel rolls. He has medical blue gloves on for some reason. I don't know what kind of a search he was thinking he was going to do on this guy. But basically what he does is he starts firing rounds at the back of his patrol car. He empties an entire magazine. He reloads and he starts firing more. There's a sergeant who's, basically on the other side of the car. His grouping was all over the place. Terrible shot placement, which is probably a good thing for the guy in the back of the car, right? So there was a female sergeant on scene who sees this. And, as he's yelling shots fired, she starts shooting into the car too. I'm going to be honest, I actually have more of a problem with her actions than I do with his actions. Because in order for police officers to legally, lawfully, within policy, fire their weapons, they can't just shoot their guns and fire their weapons because that guy is doing it or because that officer is doing it. No, you have to be able to articulate an independent threat. So here's my question to that female sergeant. What was the independent threat that you saw? What was the independent threat that you saw that you end up firing your weapon? None. Basically, she was shooting because he was shooting. The good news is that somehow the guy in the back seat was not hit. He was not injured. That is a good thing. That is 100% good thing. So he was not injured. Obviously, during there's going to be an internal investigation on this. For a situation like this, I would expect a police officer. I would expect a police officer to, for sure be. I would expect a police officer for sure be terminated, fired, and maybe even charged with a crime. Yeah, I would, maybe even be charged with a crime. I would think that. But however, that's not what happened. The officer basically, during the internal investigation, the officer resigned during the internal investigation. So he resigned. Obviously, he's not going to be picked up as a police officer anymore, but he's also not going to be criminally charged. I could see a situation where the officer would be criminally charged, and essentially what we would have to do in a situation like that is, the officer would basically have to say, why he reasonably thought it was a threat, and I don't see how you get there because again, it was an acorn. So I'm not saying this officer was a bad guy, but he made a mistake, and it's absolutely ridiculous. So the memes of cops shooting at acorns is a hilarious meme, and So and it's because no one was injured that we can go ahead and laugh about it. Steve Ladner says fast food workers are held to higher standards. I don't know, Steve. I mean, this guy. So Steve, obviously what you said is silly, but I would, if this guy kept his job, I'd be like, yeah, you got me, Steve. But no, I mean, he resigned, and again, if he resigned, and if that wouldn't have been the case, I would see it. I mean, there's always an argument that people who do hair have more professional hours than police academy. I've debunked that multiple times. That isn't true. So yeah, that's that case. It's absolutely a ridiculous thing, and the dispute between thoughts of a police officer and then my friend Drew Breezy over at What Say Drew. Their dispute was basically about thoughts of a police officer, Officer Ben. He was basically joking about it, sharing the memes, and the other side, Drew Breezy, was saying that we should take this a little more seriously. I love them both, but no, when cops do ridiculous shit, I think it's important to talk about how ridiculous it is. And again, to me, the most concerning thing is that the sergeant on scene also began to fire her weapon because that was absolutely insane. Doesn't make any sense. All right, so this last officer involved shooting that we're going to go ahead and talk about. This is a controversial officer involved shooting. Ben Crump is actually involved, representing the woman who was shot by police officers. So this isn't a funny case. This is a serious case. So we're going to go ahead and talk about it, and I'm really curious to see what anybody else thinks about it. One more comment from Steve. Cop in San Antonio beat up a handcuffed pregnant woman and was rehired and rewarded with back pay. Fast food workers are held to higher standards. I don't know, Steve. Can you put the name of the person in there? So just really quick on Steve's comment. So Steve basically says that a San Antonio cop did something wrong. He was rehired and rewarded with back pay. So let me just break that down a little bit. So when he said rewarded, or when he says rehired, to me that seems like the police department fired the individual. So it seems like, whatever the officer did in that situation, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, whatever the officer did, he was fired by the city, which again, if a cop messes up, well, I think we all agree they should be fired, right? Or does something, criminal or something egregious, they should be fired. So we have the individual who was, the officer was fired, and then, when it says rehired, to me that seems like that was per the order of a court. So my guess is he was fired, then he challenged the termination. Basically, a court told the police department that they had to rehire him with back pay. So again, if we're going to put, so who would be to blame on that? Would it be to blame the police department who fired the guy and was forced to rehire him? No, I guess we have to blame the court system, which again, there's not a lot we can do about the court system. So the fact that the court system, made the police department hire him back, to me makes it seem like it's not as simple as you put in there. That's just my opinion. Rights Camera Action, good to see you. LAPD shot a man holding a plastic fork. Yes, Rights Camera Action. That was absolutely a legal, lawful, reasonable officer involved shooting. I covered it over on my channel, Police Law News, over on Twitter and Instagram. I do think that was a legal and reasonable officer involved shooting, and I can cover that case next week. I can cover that case next week, Rights Camera Action, and explain why, and we can go back and forth and have a good time with it. So this case basically happened on February 3rd in Harris County, Texas. Basically police officers fired at a woman who was walking towards the door with a gun. A lot of these different cases have questions. So the question that I'm going to ask, which I think is the important question to ask, is that here's whether or not the shooting was within policy or within the law, objectively reasonable. We have to ask, was it reasonable for the officers to believe that the woman approaching the door with a gun was an armed burglar? So did cops have a reason to think that this woman was a burglar? How long should cops wait to fire their guns? Let me tell you what happened. So police officers, or deputies, I guess, in Harris County, Texas, were dispatched to a call at an apartment complex. Yeah, Steve, Ben Crump's on this case. Police officers were dispatched to a call at an apartment complex. I think the call was for residential burglary. So police officers go to the call and they talk to the person. And it turns out whatever they were there for didn't really happen. So there wasn't a burglary or wasn't a trespass, but whatever it was, it ended up being nothing. But cops are talking to, one of the witnesses, and they said, hey, you know what happened? Up above me, I think there was actually another burglary that happened. And cops are kind of like, well, hang on, what? And they're like, yeah, we heard a glass break and crash, and we heard someone walking around up there, and yeah, there's a lady who lives up there, but we think her house is being burglarized, a couple minutes ago. And the cops are like, all right, okay, let's deal with it, right? So the police do basically what they're supposed to do. They go ahead and investigate it. And when it comes to tactics, I'm going to disagree on what they did, and I'll tell you about that at the end. But let me tell you what they did do. So basically, it was two female police officers, and they walk up the stairs to the apartment. And so when you're on a call for service, a lot of times what people tell you isn't exactly what's correct, because again, people aren't trained witnesses, and a lot of times they only half hear something. So a lot of times when witnesses tell a police officer something, it's not always accurate, it's not correct, or there's some context that's missing. So a lot of times when a police officer hears something like that, the first thing they do is they kind of go and check it out, and they go, well, does the evidence match what I'm being told? And if so, okay, then maybe we have something here. I mean, that's a reasonable thing for a police officer to do. So the officers walk up the stairs, and they see a couple things. They see that there's a screen that had been basically moved away from the window and was resting on the other side of the wall, and they see glass broken. They see a broken window with glass broken. Okay, so they have a witness who, again, is independent witness and shouldn't have any skin in the game to try to get anybody in trouble. You have a witness, again, who lives underneath, who lives, right below. They should have an idea of what's happening in their building. So you have a witness who says, hey, there was a burglary. Then the cops go upstairs and they see evidence of a burglary, right? So now the cops are both thinking, okay, we probably have a residential burglary. Now it's at this point I would have done something a little bit different than the police officers did. I'll tell you that in a second, but here's what they did do. They basically walked up and, one of the officers was pretty much holding on the window because they could look through the window and see what was going on inside. And another officer basically walked up right to the front door, knocked, rang the doorbell, knocked, and yelled, "Sheriff's Department, Sheriff's Department." Basically to let them know what was going on. And basically what happened is there was a woman inside, and the woman, Miss Pouncey, Ebony Pouncey is her name. And Miss Pouncey was inside the residence. She grabs a firearm, and she starts approaching the front door with a firearm in her hand. Okay, and it's as she's approaching the front door, it's at that point that both police officers basically unload on her. They go through a couple different magazines, and they shoot her a bunch of times. I believe she shot 5 different times somehow, and thankfully, Miss Pouncey survives. Now, let's break this down a little bit. So who is Miss Pouncey? So let's talk about it from her perspective. So Miss Pouncey is a friend of the woman who owns the apartment. Well, Miss Pouncey essentially got permission to go over to the friend's apartment, but the friend didn't have a key. So the friend told Miss Pouncey, hey, you can go ahead and break the window to get in. So from her perspective, from her point of view, she's not doing anything wrong. She's not doing anything illegal. She had permission to be there, and the friend who owned the apartment, or was the tenant of the apartment, gave her permission to break the window in order to get in. So Miss Pouncey, from her perspective, she didn't do anything wrong. She's a normal person living her day, and she had total permission to do what she did. Now let's look at it from the point of police officers. Police officers weren't just running around harassing people or saying, hey, let's ring doorbells and screw with people. No, police officers were specifically told, hey, I think there was was a residential burglary up there. And then they walk up and they see evidence that anybody would think is evidence of a residential burglary. So and again, they weren't just like creeping around the apartment or the house like a Stephen Perkins case, right? What they did is they knocked on the door and they said, Sheriff's Department. We know this because it's on body camera video. I love body camera video because otherwise Ben Crump would lie and say the police officers never identified themselves, like they lied about that in the Breonna Taylor case, right? But we know that the police officers knocked and yelled Sheriff's Department, okay? So it's now police officers at this point, they think that they have a residential burglary. They've announced themselves loudly as police, right? There's no question this is the reality, the objective reality of what happened. Now you have someone inside the residence. Now here's my question. Is it reasonable for the police officers to believe that Miss Pouncey is a residential burglary, which is a felon, that she had just committed the felony of residential burglary? Like, is it reasonable for the police officers to think that? Well, yeah, it is. It doesn't mean that Miss Pouncey is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but in the moment, when you only have like 1 or 2 seconds to say, hey, this person in there, like, what do I think they are? Anybody would think that, yeah, it's a reasonable thing. So now you have someone who you reasonably believe just committed a felony. You've already announced police. Now they're walking to the door with a gun. What are you thinking as a police officer? You're thinking this person just committed a felony. They know that I'm a police officer because I yelled Sheriff's Department, and they're approaching the door with a gun. So that's what the police officers were thinking in the moment. And I'm telling you, yes, they weren't right, but I'm telling you that is not an unreasonable thing for those officers to think. So as Miss Pouncey is about to open the door, the police officers shoot her. Again, it ends up being that, that she was the friend. And obviously it's a tragedy because we didn't want this to happen. So earlier I said I would have done something different. What would I have done different? Not just what I have done different. Let's talk about best practices. What should police departments, what should training academies, what should instructors, what should police leaders, what should we tell police officers to do in a situation like this? And I said this a lot of times. Police officers are really good at following instructions. What I mean is you write a policy and then you train them how to do something. Most of the time they're going to do that. Not all the time, but most of the time they're going to do that. So let's talk about this, and please put in the comments if you disagree with me or if you have any idea. Or if you have any idea what police officers should do. So here's my opinion. Here's my opinion of what the officers should have done. So I think that they took the report, or they had the information that there was a burglary, and they went up and they looked around and they checked. I think that was the right thing to do, right? Now, once they checked and they saw the evidence of the burglary, they saw the screen move, they saw the broken glass. To me, at that point, that's pretty good evidence that they have a residential burglary. Now, there could be someone inside. My guess is that the SOP, the training, I don't know, any police training that would say, hey, if you think you have a felon inside of a place like a residential burglary, you just knock on the door and ring the doorbell and yell police. That's probably not the right thing to do. What I would do is and I think what basically policy and tactics should be is the officer should have gotten the radio and say, hey, you know what? We think we have a residential burglary. Here's what the apartment number is going to be. Can we get 2 officers on the south side of the house, 1 officer on the north side of the house? Can we get a sergeant and a CIT? If that stuff is available, you set up a perimeter around the house. You go back from a place of cover, right? So either downstairs or behind, and you try to go to a place of cover, and that's how you try to make contact. And you give very clear instructions. This is the Harris County Sheriff's Department, apartment 2B. Can we please have all occupants exit with your hands up and empty? And you try to go about that. While you're trying to give commands, you also have dispatch try to reach the owner of the house, right? Because police officers have unbelievable databases, right? Or you try to get a hold of the apartment manager. Police officers basically, rights camera action, yes, around the place. Police officers basically have access to managers of apartments, like their personal cell phone numbers a lot of the times, or they could go ahead and give a call. It would take 5 or so. You have the place surrounded and you have one officer doing some research, right? So you have one officer doing some research that says, hey, now we're going to contact the apartment manager. Then you go ahead and you get and again, cops aren't paid they're paid by the hour, but it's like, there's no hurry. There's no reason to rush this, right? There's no reason reason to rush any of this. Take your time, especially if it's a possible felony. So you contact the apartment manager, then you contact the owner of the house. Hey, I'm Officer Daniel with the Harris County Sheriff's Department. And hey, listen, it looks like someone knocked out the window of your house. Just making sure. Is anybody supposed to be there? Was it like that when you left? Then you would have had the woman say, oh yeah, actually my friend Ebony, she's in the house. I told her to do that. There is no burglary, right? So it's like these are the kinds of things that police officers can do on the front end. And here's what I'm going to say is that really the fix to this, if we want police officers to be better, because as I've said before, the goal of this show, the goal of my content, the goal of the articles I write, the goal is basically to make it so there's less violence between citizens and police. And a lot of times we have to really examine policies and training and practice of police. And then on the other side, we also have to, a lot of times if, people just didn't resist arrest and fight with cops, that this would all be avoided. But this is a situation where I honestly think that a different policy, a different training, different tactics could have avoided this. So in a situation like this, once, here's what I'm going to say. It's like, once all of the way to fix this, it's all on the front end. It's all in how police respond to an incident like this on the front end. The steps that I said about making sure the place is surrounded and doing a little bit of research and using a real-time crime center or the police databases to try to get some more information before you just go knock on the door. That's where the fix to this is. Because here's the thing. Once you're in a situation where you honestly believe that there's a felon inside the building and that felon is walking towards the door with the gun, expecting police officers to be perfect in that moment, that is not the fix to this. We're always going to have trouble if that's where we get to. Because then you have to ask yourself, okay, you're a police officer who honestly believes that someone who committed a felony is approaching the door with a gun. The question is, how long do you wait? Do you wait until the person has the door open? Do you wait until the gun is pointed at you? Do you wait until your partner is dead? Like that's a tough question to ask, and it's for that reason I do think that this shooting was objectively reasonable. It was within the law. I do think that the shooting was within the law because again, if the police officers had a reasonable belief that she was a residential burglar, which they do, and she's walking towards the door with a gun. So now they have someone who they honestly believe, and reasonably, like an independent, reasonable person in that situation would say, yeah, that's okay. Someone who committed a felony is now approaching the door with a gun. That's the question. How long do you wait? If there is training or policy or law that tells a police officer exactly when they could fire, please put it in the chat. I'm real curious because I'm telling you there isn't. The standard is what is objectively reasonable. Can the police officers articulate an imminent threat? And in this case, they did. And the reason why I'm saying that and harping on this because I want situations like this to happen less. That's the goal. But the fix, again, is not when the police officer they're already at the door and Miss Pouncey is coming to the door with a gun and police officers have 3/4 of a second to make a decision. If you think that situations like this are going to be fixed, if you wait until then, it's not. Anything the officers can do, it's all on the front end. To slow down, to involve a sergeant, to use your resources. And it's all of this de-escalation and resources on the front end. That's how we fix this. Rights camera action, it's called backing up. I agree 100%. So yeah, let me see some of the comments here. Let's see. Steve says, using your logic, if a nosy neighbor is sitting in one of his homes cleaning his guns, you can call police to take him out. Yeah, I don't know, Steve. I mean, again, like the police officers in a situation like this had evidence of a residential burglary. Again, I think that's objective. That's not me being biased. Anyone in that situation would think it's a residential burglary. My issue with what the officers did is that once they had very good evidence of a residential burglary, is that they didn't do anything else. They didn't back up. They didn't set a perimeter. They didn't try to get a hold of the owner. They didn't contact a sergeant. They didn't do all of these other things on the front end. And here's the thing. What if this, and I don't know anything about Harris County, Texas. I know Harris County, I think, is near in the Houston area, so my guess is a pretty big sheriff's department, but I don't know how big it is. What if those deputies, the things very simple things I'm saying now, what if they never had that training? What if they never had that education? What if, this wasn't the standard operating procedure? What if the way they did it is exactly what they've been told to do? Well, then it's really difficult to blame the police officers. And we have to blame the politicians who run the police department and who are both supposed to be the ones who are in charge of putting training like this together. It's one of my problems with the defund the police movement is that when you defund police, you do things or you take away resources. You take away not having a real-time crime center, not having enough officers to where, hey, maybe those 2 officers were the only, probably not in Harris County, but what if it's more of a rural place and you have a situation like this? And what if these are the only 2 deputies that are working that night and there is no backup? It's only them. Again, like these things that we want police officers to do to avoid situations like this, it might not be possible. So, when you do things like defund police, you take away the different resources and the different trainers to come in to talk about this kind of stuff. And again, I want less officer involved shootings. And I'm telling you, in this case, what I think the police officers could have done differently to avoid it. Again, that being said, I do think it was a legal, reasonable officer-involved shooting. I don't think the police officers should be criminally charged, and I don't think that they should be fired. I think what they did in the moment was objectively reasonable. Pulling the trigger in the moment they did, I get why they did it, unless they violated some policy before they got there. Was there policy in place that they were supposed to notify a sergeant, that they were supposed to set a perimeter? Is there some training or policy that they violated? I think that's where the fix is. Also, when you defund the police, we got to talk about mental health as well. You're going to have more mental health crises, if police departments and cities don't put some emphasis on that as well. JS says, police are framing people for making charges for some people. I don't know, Jay. The kind of the way that I run this show and really all the content I do is I like specific things. I think it's very easy to say that, the police frame people, the police are racist, the police are this. And just as honest as I could be, Jay, that just isn't very interesting. So if you have a specific case, like, hey, here's one case, here's 2 cases where the police did this. Hey, Dan, can you go ahead and talk about this? Yeah, let's talk about it. And if the cops messed up, I'll tell you they messed up. If the cops committed a crime, I'll say, yeah, they should probably be prosecuted for that. And Jay, one of the things on the show is that even after the show ends, if you put a case in the chat, I pretty much check it throughout the week. And, I probably will go ahead and cover it next week if you have any ideas for us. So all right, so that's going to be the end of the show. That was the last case that we were going to cover today. Again, I want to thank everybody for being a part of it. We got some really good questions in here, and I really like and enjoy the back and forth. So I think that one of the next cases that I'm going to go ahead and one of the next cases, Miguel, I talked about the Acorn case. Go ahead and rewatch the show, Miguel. The Acorn case was the first officer-involved shooting case that I covered. It was about 20 minutes into the show, Miguel. So go ahead and watch it. Put your comments in the chat. Jay, thank you so much. Again, definitely go ahead and subscribe to the channel and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Make sure that you share it, and we like to affect change on this channel, so definitely go ahead and call your lawmaker to make sure that acorn laws are in place and that acorns are regulated and that they aren't for everybody's use. We see what could happen when there are rogue acorns. All right, again, my name is Daniel. Go ahead and follow me over at Police Law News everywhere. Hope everyone has a great and safe weekend, and we will see you next week. Thanks.